Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. Today, I have a special episode for you about the lunar nodes with the astrologer Aerin Fogel. As we talk about in the episode, the lunar nodes are the points where the sun's ecliptic and the moon's path intersect, more or less. I wanted to point out that the other planets have nodes in relation to the sun's path as well. In my episode with Jared Williams, we talk about that a bit more, but in today's episode, we're focusing on the lunar nodes in particular. As we also talked about in the episode, Aerin's band Queen of Swords is currently touring. Aerin is playing a show at Pop Montreal on September 28th, so if you're in the area, please see the website linked in the show notes for more information. Before we dive into the conversation, I also wanted to give y'all a little update on my life, especially as it relates to the podcast. So I'm moving back to New York, and I will be driving across the country from Los Angeles to New York the last week in September. This will coincide with the beginning of Libra season, so I will likely get that first Libra Moon episode uploaded a little later than I usually would. I just wanted to let y'all know about that. In addition, if you have any suggestions for things that I should see on my cross-country trip, please hit me up on social media and let me know. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm offering natal and timing consultations as well as answering query questions. I also offer transcription, captioning, and audio and video editing. Thanks again to all those that have offered their generous support. I really appreciate you. Now for today's conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Please be sure to check out the links to Aerin's website and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. All right, Aerin Fogel, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk to you about the lunar nodes. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm super excited for this chat. Been thinking about it a lot.
Great. I'm so glad to hear it. First question off the bat, I'd just like to ask guests generally how the astro weather is treating them. Has anything been going on in your life that's like synchronized with Venus retrograde or Mars in Virgo or Mercury in Virgo or anything like that?
Yeah, all of the above.
Mm.
I'm sort of in one of those astrological times where every transit is activating something important in my chart.
Oh, wow.
So it feels like a wild time. There's lots of like really beautiful things going
Hmm.
on, lots of challenging things. But yeah, just trying to go one step at a time with all of it. It's interesting. I had such a Venus retrograde aha moment thinking
Hmm.
about I had thought about a lot like, okay, summer of 2008, summer of 2015, what was going on then, 8 years
Hmm.
ago, blah, blah, blah. And then I started going back further and further like, oh, summer of 2007. Oh,
Yeah.
summer of 1999. And I just kind of, blew the lid off of my own brain a little bit because I don't think I had gone that far back specifically with the Venus retrogrades in Virgo and Leo, at least in a
Hmm.
while. So there were some parallels from 1999 that have come up for me during this Venus retrograde cycle that have been really fascinating.
Wow, very interesting. I've looked at 2015, I looked at '07. I got to go back to 1999. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to remember what was going on in my life then, but maybe I'll be able to put things together. It's very Venus retrograde. In my ninth, I'm like back home where I grew up for the first time in like 5 years.
Oh, wow.
So it feels very kind of astrologer good. But yeah, the in 2007, that summer, I moved from my hometown, which I had never left before, to go to college. And then in
Mhm.
2015, when Jupiter retrograded in Leo, I moved. And then 2 months later, when Venus retrograded in Leo, or like a few months later, I moved again. So
Oh, wow.
um, planetary retrogrades in my ninth are very much like, all right, we're moving state. Sweet.
Oh,
Time to like
yeah.
start a new chapter.
Yeah, that's pretty big. I mean, retrogrades can be so disruptive in that way too, even if it's ultimately something positive or cathartic. It can really
Hmm.
um, stir a lot of soil up, or kind of like tilling the soil a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, wonderful. Erin, can you offer us an introduction to yourself and your practice?
Sure. So my name is Aerin Fogel. You can find me on the internet. I have been practicing consulting astrologer for about 12 years now, but studying astrology unofficially since I was a teenager. And then a little more seriously, maybe about 16 years ago was when I started focusing on my studies more seriously.
Cool.
And at that time, I started with an apprenticeship with my teacher, Julie Simmons, and
Mm,
then went on from there to, kind of broaden my scope and do a lot of deeper learning. So, as an astrologer, I don't like to hem myself in too much because I've been fortunate to learn from a lot of different traditions over those years.
mhm,
But I guess to categorize myself a little bit, I'm somewhere in a blend of modern healing psychological astrology with traditional techniques and foundation. And then, in addition to my astrology work, I also work with a modality that does core pattern readings.
mm,
So it's kind of like looking at trauma from a soul perspective and like people's root wounds that they're working
mhm,
with and the patterns that come from there.
mhm,
And I also do tarot. And so, yeah, I consult with people sort of as my 9 to 5. And I had been running a festival for about 7 years. And I stepped back at my Saturn square
mm,
of the festival. It's called Venus, or it is called Venus Fest. The festival is continuing. And it was working with underrepresented identities in music.
mhm.
And I'm also a musician myself. I have a project called Queen of Swords. So that's as brief as I could be with my introduction. Oh, and I live in Toronto, that too.
Awesome. Yeah, and in honor of you being my guest today, I have my Canada mug, my Canada coffee mug
Yes.
today.
Oh my god, I love it.
Um,
Perfect.
yeah, and your as a part of your musical project, you just put out an album and you've just been like going on tour, so people should keep an eye out on that. I know that you have some dates planning, so it's tentative, but people should definitely follow along with that. And I was just listening to your intergenerational astrology episode with Chris Brennan on the astrology podcast, and it seems like yeah, there you're having an interesting conversation about being of the first generation of Hellenistic students. So you already had this kind of modern
Mm,
framework, and the benefit of that was that modern astrology is very kind of takes a lot from counseling and psychology, and is very kind of client focused in a caring, very caring kind of careful way in terms of
mhm,
navigating the inner life of the person. And one of the things that you were talking about, which I find really interesting because I'm kind of like the next generation, I think, of Hellenistic students, where I don't have
mm,
the modern foundation in astrology. And you're talking
yeah.
about kind of, if some of us will have those same kinds of skills, um, and so it's just interesting. I was reminded of like needing to read Mark Jones's book or take his counseling course, and kind of make use of some of those resources to make sure that not only are the technical skills kind of sharp, but the counseling skills are also there as well, because it's really important.
Yeah, and yeah, I guess some of that depends on what people wanna do with their astrology. Like, I'm obviously heavily focused on counseling and working with people, so to me, that's a really core component of it, but not all astrologers
Right.
consult or really focus on that. Some of them are, research astrologers or teachers, and from that perspective, it might not
Right.
be as foundational, but the reason I got into astrology in the first place was that I had an astrology reading when I was, like, 20, And I was trying to figure out what I was doing with my life, and it was so profoundly supportive on so many levels, of just my understanding of self and my relation to this planet and the cosmos, and kind of placing myself
Mm,
in context of everything, that I really understood it to be something that can
right.
help people. And so I'm always thinking about, is this helpful? Like, is this information going to help me help someone when they sit down with me and want to talk about their life? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no when it comes to technique. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, I'm always thinking about it through the lens of like, is this something that's actually going to support someone in living their day-to-day life?
Mm-hmm.
And if not, how can I go deeper into it in a way that can access it at that level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And a thing I really appreciated that you said about your practice in that conversation was that you're very kind of remediation's not perhaps not the right word, but not only identifying the patterns and placing people in context, but also like how can we navigate what actions can we take to kind of work with the astrological influences that are at play in our birth charts. And I think that that's really important, because it kind of plays into this kind of fate versus free will
Mm.
tension that's like just very exciting for me as a part of astrology of like what are the things that we're fated for and perhaps have less agency to change, and where can we find agency and where can we exercise agency in our lives to kind of live the best lives we can.
Yeah, I feel like the longer I'm an astrologer, the more I become polarized about that within myself because
Mm,
for myself, practicing astrology for so many years, and then also at this point, having the privilege of working with people over such long periods of time, I witness profound change in people from
mhm,
really working with their lives in such a deep way, and very earnestly approaching change and personal growth. And so I see, okay, there is this element of personal will happening there, and choice and intention.
mhm,
And there's this like beautiful trajectory of growth. And then at the same time, it's more and more just like everything that's happening is reflected in the astrology to the point where it just feels fatalistic to me as well,
mm,
including the growth. So
yeah,
I'm just more and more polarized about that in myself. And I don't really, I don't have a clear answer about it, but in some ways, maybe both are true.
yeah, yeah, I tend to think so too. Yeah, it's a tough thing to think about, and yeah, but it's really interesting, I think, and I think that right now in my kind of astrological studies, it's kind of one of the most, I think, core questions.
Mm.
Um, how to not kind of be polar about it, be like dualistic about it, where it's like an either or, and how to have it be a dialogue between
Mm.
fate and free will, you know? So it's like giving both of these things their place in a more nuanced way.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really beautiful. I feel like that's often how our life works, right? It's like there's circumstance that comes to us, and that's maybe fate or situation that happens, but we're still agents within that. There's still like a person having an experience and having a response, and that can change a lot about even just the experiential or subjective aspect of something.
Yeah, absolutely. And to not go on too much more of a tangent of this, I really do believe that sometimes a thing can only be possible for a person if they believe that it's possible. Like
Mm.
there is a kind of like law of attraction kind of
Yeah.
element to it, where it's like if I believe I can do something, that opens up my horizon, it opens up my perspective, so that thing is possible. I can't do it if I don't think it's possible, you know. And sometimes I think I'm reminded of my conversation with Daniel Norman, in like the What Makes an Astrologer series we did, where it was
Mm.
basically just like kind of like who cares about astrological like placements in a chart for whether you're an astrologer or not. Like, if you want to do it, just do it, you know? It's
Mhm.
like, and if it's meant for you, it'll be meant for you. And if it's not, you'll make the choice to move on to something else, or you'll be moved to something else. And it's like, I don't know. Maybe it's like the sad rising in me. But I'm just kind of like, we have one life. Like, let's just do the things that we want to do and do the things that will bring us joy and meaning, because we shouldn't hold ourselves back. Like, life is hard enough.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's funny. I was, like, hearing Jupiter in there as you were talking. So thinking that it is, like, such a beautiful Sag rising perspective, but also
Hmm.
thinking about Jupiter, there's the sense that it's what we believe in or it's what we hope for. There's this feeling of like we have to believe in it for it to become possible. But Jupiter also creates the laws.
Yeah.
And so our hope and our belief has a lot to do with the rules that get constructed
Hmm.
and the rules that govern our reality and our functioning. So I do think that's very true. And it's
Hmm.
Jupiter stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe this is my own personal journey that I'm living out, kind of what I'm talking about right now, because Jupiter rules my ascendant. I have Jupiter and Saturn kind of opposing each other. And I'm reminded of
Mm,
Ari Felix's work, where they talk about like world building and how does Saturn build worlds and how does Jupiter build worlds, and they talk about Saturn as kind of the natural law, like
mm,
gravity. It's not something we made up. It's something that we kind of figure out is happening, and there's kind of no Earth as we have it in which gravity is not going to be a force that we have to contend with. But yeah, like Jupiter is the kind of laws that we create together through consensus and through
mm,
our study of philosophy. Like, so it's like slightly these kinds of different kinds of laws. And I feel like that is being spoken to in this conversation of like, what is fate and what is free will? What can we not choose, Saturn, and what can we choose, Jupiter?
mm.
um so
I love that. I mean, I feel like we could take this in a whole like great conjunction episode direction, but then
ooh, yeah.
also at the same time, that feels so relevant to the nodes. Is that kind
Mm,
of like intersection of uh fate and personal will actually is a lot how I think about the
mm.
nodes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it reminds me of how we construct or how we think about the lot of fortune and the lot of spirit,
Mm,
and the lot of the moon is the lot of fortune is associated with fate, and the lot of spirit is the lot of the sun is associated with the things that we have, like, kind of have to choose in a sense.
mm,
And the nodes are the literal intersections of the sun and moon, their
mhm.
path. So I'll let you give the definitions though. You're my guest today. Can you tell us what the lunar nodes are, kind of astronomically?
Yeah, I think that was a very great, succinct description that you just gave. They are the point of intersection between the path of the sun, which we call the ecliptic, and the apparent path of the moon. So if you were to draw them out in the sky from our perspective on Earth, the nodes would be the 2 points at which those intersect with one another. And so the north node is the point where the moon starts to cross north of the sun's ecliptic. So it's ascending over the sun's ecliptic. And then the south node is the point where the moon crosses to be below the sun's ecliptic. And
Mm,
they're always exactly opposite one another in the zodiac, 180 degrees apart.
mhm. And they shift in this kind of, I guess, if we can get into kind of what they are astrologically now.
Hmm.
When we look at like a chart, the nodes are always kind of shifting against zodiacal motion, like in diurnal motion, right? They move in a retrograde fashion. Um, so can you tell us a little bit about that, and like, I'm like, why the nodes move? Because the sun's kind of path is generally pretty constant. We think about the sun, we think about constancy and fixity in the sign of Leo. Um, but does the moon's motion, does that kind of shift, and that's why the nodes shift? Or can you
Mm.
tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the moon's motion has more to do with the ascending and descending process that we were talking about because in a moon cycle, like the moon will spend about 2 weeks, so half of its cycle in the ascending part or north of the sun's ecliptic, and then about 2 weeks south of the sun's ecliptic. So that's more to do with the moon's motion. But the sun is slowly moving along the ecliptic throughout the year. So that has a
Hmm.
lot to do with the movement of the nodes through the zodiac is the sun's slow day-to-day progression through the zodiac along the
Mm,
ecliptic. But the nodes themselves, as you were saying, move backwards through the zodiac. So I always find that to be kind of an interesting symbol because I find that they have a lot to do with time and sort of like relationship to time and chapters of time.
mm,
And their backwards motion is like a bit of a time fuck. Like it's
mm,
changing our experience of something or kind of warping our perception of time a little bit. And
mm,
I know we're going to talk about eclipses later, but I think that that's something that happens during eclipse season is that our sense of time can collapse or get warped or get extenuated in these really bizarre and sometimes interesting ways.
mm. Yeah, and I'm reminded of my conversation with Amaya, who talked about how eclipses affect other animals, and
Mhm.
birds will like literally just not go out all day
Mhm.
because it's like they think it's nighttime, or they're just like, this is weird. We're not we're
Yeah.
not doing this. Um
Totally.
yeah, so it's really interesting, like observing these things as they affect the more than human, whether it be, kind of other animals or what have you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and the nodes have their own cycles too, which is always something that reminds me of our relationship to nature, and I love
Hmm.
astrology for its cycles and the specific way of experiencing time that we get through understanding cyclical motion. So the nodes have um their cycle takes about 18 and a half years, or it's like 18 years, 7 months and a bit for them to make a full rotation through the zodiac.
Mm,
So that's always an interesting thing to think about. We were talking about in the beginning, like the Venus retrograde cycles and the kind of 8-year parallels. If someone is older than 19, they can think about like the parallels of the lunar node cycle in their lives.
hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We'll get more into that a little bit.
Hmm.
Yeah, I wonder if you have anything in addition to say, about the nodes astrologically. There's kinds of like certain dignity schemas, and there's a lot of mythical representations of the nodes that I think are important. So just curious to hear
Hmm.
your thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is something that starts to get into like different perspectives and different opinions depending on the tradition that you're working with, which I
Hmm.
think is really interesting because the nodes are not planets, so they function differently astrologically than a planet would, but also there's a lot more difference in perspective on them than, say, the planets and the signs, where even across like the many different modalities of astrology and tropical and sidereal, there's like fairly common consensus on the representation of planets and signs, and not
Hmm.
necessarily the case for the nodes. So I think this is where we start to get into interesting territory with them because they might have more cultural correspondence or more generational correspondence or more context than, say, planets and signs in astrology. But for, a lot of the branches of astrology, the nodes, are, I guess, peregrine. Like, there's no dignity to the nodes.
Hmm.
They don't have rulers, they don't rule anything, and there are a couple branches where that's not the case, like in Vedic astrology, the South Node would be the ruler of Scorpio, and the North Node is the ruler of Aquarius. Uh,
Mm,
and then I think I'm pretty sure it's in one of Al-Biruni's texts. He equates the North Node exalted in Gemini and South Node exalted in Sagittarius.
mhm,
But other than that, especially in a lot of the tropical astrology traditions, we don't really see rulership for the nodes.
mhm,
And so to me, that adds a kind of interesting amoral quality to them,
mhm,
where there's no dignity or exaltation. There's also no fall. There's nothing that makes them good or bad, or
mhm,
there's nothing that gives them preference or strength or some kind of power in some areas of the zodiac that they may not have in others. So that's already kind
mm,
of just an interesting way to consider them. At least the way that I work with them is without dignity. And so therefore there's a kind of neutral or amoral quality to them.
mm. Yeah, absolutely. Cool, thank you for explaining that.
Mhm.
Yeah, given your I'm not sure if you have an evolutionary background as well, but given your kind of modern psychological, foundation, uh, do you wanna talk a little bit about, like, how the nodes are viewed within that tradition or how they're viewed in
Mhm.
a kind of evolutionary astrology?
Yeah. The first way that I was introduced to the nodes when I started studying is probably closest to an evolutionary perspective, which would be that the nodes represent some kind of growth trajectory in the person's life.
Mhm,
And some astrologers will hold that as a kind of like karmic axis, where the south node represents the person's past life karma or their sort of imprint that they've come here with, and the north node represents some kind of growing edge for them.
mhm,
So that's one perspective. It's not so much how I think of them myself in my practice, and even learning it at that time, I was like, I wonder about that.
mm,
It never quite it never quite clicked for me in that way as I was working with charts.
mhm,
Um, but there's a few ways to think about them. So that would be the evolutionary perspective. And in the more traditional perspective, they have more to do with increase and decrease. So
mhm,
the North Node has a kind of hunger to it, or it's something that will bring increase or growth in certain areas. And the South Node is a place of decrease or like a letting go, or sometimes a severing or cutting off that can happen.
mhm,
And then from the Vedic perspective, uh, there's a really beautiful story of Rahu and Ketu that's part of the mythology there. And Rahu and Ketu were formerly like one immortal being that couldn't be killed, and there's like this story of this divine nectar that's going around and being given to all the gods,
mm,
and you know, goes to steal some of the divine nectar before it's the right turn,
yeah,
and gets beheaded by Vishnu. And so Rahu and Ketu are split off now into two beings, where Rahu is the head and Ketu is the body,
mm,
and can't be killed because they're immortal beings. So, from that perspective, Rahu has this kind of like orientation towards a good life, like
mm,
material satisfaction and wealth and goodness and, hedonistic pleasure and all of this, but it's like a hungry ghost, like a head
mm,
chopped off from a body. There's no deeper soul or spiritual satisfaction there. And conversely, Ketu can bring like profound spiritual awakening, but also lend itself towards a kind of asceticism
mm,
and not necessarily bode well for like the person's comfort in life or their ability to like live well in the world beyond their soul perspective. So yeah, there's a few ways that we could look at the nodes depending on where you've come from, but over like many years of working with people and talking to people about their lives, I've kind of blended my own perspective on what the nodes really are. That probably takes a little bit from all of these traditions in different ways, and um, has more also to do with the research work that I've been doing in the intergenerational theories as well.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting to kind of I'm interested to hear more about the intergenerational aspect of the nodes, and I think it's an interesting kind of alternative manifestation of this idea of like a karmic thing because
Mm,
it's like in some ways, like I'm not an expert on karma, but it's like there feels like a connection between spiritually this kind of idea of the places you've come from and like literally your physical biology and
mhm,
epigenetics and how the experiences of past generations affect who you are as a person today. And so that feels like a very tangible kind of manifestation of the nodes in some way. And so I'm really, really curious to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think at the heart of it, I have come to understand the nodes as representative of our patterning. And so there's many ways that you could look at that. And I think patterning fits with all of these different branches and perspectives within astrology. But all of us have some kind of fundamental habit place or comfort that we default to, often not something that actually functions in our own highest good. I
Mm,
think a lot of the time our own patterning works against us,
mm,
but it is a product of our epigenetics, of our intergenerational connections, of our culture that we grow up in. Like, we are a product of our circumstance. And often our most difficult patterning and challenges are these like repetitive cycles that we come back to, are things that are formed out of our family dynamics, out of our place in the world, out of our experience of the systems that we exist within. So I have come to think about the nodes as all of that.
mm,
And touching back on where we started in this sort of intersection between fate and free will, I think that the nodes often represent circumstances that come to us that we have to respond to.
mm,
And so that to me is intergenerational work, is like, as far as I know, we haven't chosen our families unless there's some kind of like soul choice that happens before we
yeah.
become a little thing in the belly. But generally, like, you're born into a family and that's that,
Hmm. Hmm.
regardless of your actual connection to them. So there's this kind of meeting, this initial meeting of circumstance that you arrive into, and then the development of an individual out of that, and the individual
Mm,
self that comes out of that intersection.
mm. Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm just getting distracted by the intersections of this with like the ideas of justice. And I'm not sure if that
Mm,
plays in astrologically anyway, but like there's
mm,
a social theorist named John Rawls who I forget the name of the theory, but it's basically a theory of justice. His, I think it's called his theory of justice. And it's basically that because we cannot choose the family that we come into, because like birth is kind of an accident, it's not something
mm,
that we choose. There's like a moral imperative to create a equality of opportunities for people
mm,
because the wealthy children or children of wealthy people who come into this world, no real choice or effort of their own, are no more entitled to good opportunities than someone who just happened to be by a twist of fate born into, another family that had less resources or less opportunities. And it's a theory that I'm very much a fan of. So it
mm.
comes to mind in relation to this. And yeah, I think it speaks to kind of what you're saying.
That's beautiful. That feels very related to the nodes, because there is this feeling of, yeah, circumstance, like what we come into and then what we do with it.
Hmm.
And it makes me think also about what the nodes actually are. They're points of intersection.
Right.
And so they function differently from a planet because, or a luminary, because they're not acting with the same kind of personality or individuation that a planet or a luminary might have. They're inherently intersectional. And so there's immediately some kind of relating that happens with the nodes.
Hmm.
Like it's a point of relating between the sun and the moon.
Hmm.
And so if we think about that symbolically, there's some kind of like lunar or personal experience that meets intersectionally with some kind of solar or more visible or more obvious or more dominant kind of condition in the world. So I love the notion of justice as like how the lunar or subjective component like meets the solar objectivity that happens in the world.
Yeah, or I think even thinking about the sun as the king or the sovereign and the moon
Mm.
as the people, and
Mm.
how do laws or how does the organization of government affect the people, affect the kind of the moon. And in our planning conversation, we talked about, I was really kind of struck by this idea that kind of came up of polyrhythms. And
Mhm.
we talk a lot about the relationship of the progressed lunar cycle and the Saturn cycle. But there does seem this kind of relationship, or I'm curious to pull this thread of the relationship between, the kind of polyrhythm between this 19-year nodal cycle and the 27-year Saturn cycle. But then there's also, it makes me just think about the different ways that different planets can relate to the nodes, and if the nodes are these kinds of intersections and these points of fatedness in some way. It's like, we talked about Jupiter and law, and it's like, how does law, the things that we decide, interrelate with that? How does the natural law of Saturn interrelate with fate, interrelate with the nodes? And so just a curious kind of thought coming up.
Mm. Yeah, there's something in there about polyrhythm and coming up against law or fate.
Hmm.
Because when I think about music, a polyrhythm is something that goes against the natural order of how our brain experiences rhythm in a pleasing way.
Yeah.
And so there's some kind of like challenge to the four on the floor rhythm that we might expect. And I feel that the nodes do that with their cycle is there's some kind of challenge or disruption to the law of Saturn and the very law-like rhythm of the moon as
Hmm.
well that functions with this kind of regularity and like that we can anticipate the cycle of the moon and lean into it and there's comfort and there's habit there and in a way it's like that with Saturn even though it can be quite challenging
Hmm.
and so the nodes kind of disrupt that or the polyrhythm comes up against that familiarity or regularity in a way which is part of how I've been thinking about their patterning is like the nodes in our personal charts will tell us a lot about our individual patterning.
Hmm.
If we look at the sign and the house that they're in and any planets at the south and north bending of the nodes or any
Hmm.
planets conjunct the nodes, um, but how we live our lives and how that plays out over time, I think they tell us a lot about how we do or just how we do or don't disrupt that patterning, or
Hmm.
perhaps our intergenerational themes or the things that we've come into the world with epigenetically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, since you mentioned the bendings, I was just curious if you could tell us a little bit more about that, as well as if you've seen any other aspects to the nodes in a chart be particularly important, like sextiles or trines, or
Mhm.
I think the square is often like the most kind of discussed aspect to the nodes.
Yes. So a square to the nodes would be either at the south or north bending. So that has to
Hmm.
do with, as we were talking about earlier, like the moon will spend 2 weeks north of the ecliptic of the sun and then 2 weeks of its cycle south of the ecliptic. So where it would be zodiacally south of the ecliptic, that's the south bending, and vice versa for the north bending. But basically, if you have a planet square the nodes, it's at the bendings,
Hmm.
to make it a little simpler.
Yeah.
And so for me, when I'm working with people or working with timing, I find that planets at the bendings or conjunct one of the nodes is going to be felt much more intensely than anything that's in a sextile or trine or, any of the minor aspects to the nodes.
Hmm.
I haven't found those to be as intense, although there's certainly like worth noting.
Yeah.
But part of what's been really interesting for me in doing the family chart readings that I've been doing for the last year or so, and then kind of in pieces like through my practice before that, is seeing that people who are really committed to or interested in activating some kind of change in their own personal, cultural, familial patterning tend to have planets at the bendings or conjunct the nodes. Like
Mm.
there's some kind of interest or commitment in disrupting the patterning that's there.
Mm.
And often it can produce very difficult life circumstances as a result. And so I think that there are many people in the world who don't initially choose to become invested in great change, but they reach for that as a product of necessity. And again, that feeling of like intersection between circumstance and choice, like often people are handed sometimes the most horrific of circumstances with absolutely no choice of their own involved.
Mm.
But a lot of the time when people have major aspects with the nodes, they will choose to do something with that that perhaps for their life and the lives of others becomes ultimately cathartic or disruptive in a very productive way or something like that.
Mm. Very interesting. Yeah, and when you talk about like a conjunction or a square, what's the orb generally? You think with that, is it like a conjunction? Can it be like a whole sign co-presence, or is the orb pretty tight with an aspect to the nodes?
For a personal chart, I wouldn't usually count like a whole sign co-presence.
Hmm.
That might be a little wide, although I do count it if I'm doing family charts and I'm
Okay.
looking at similarities. So say someone has Saturn within 3 degrees of the North Node in their chart, and then both of their parents have a whole sign co-presence with Saturn in the North Node. I'm gonna count that differently than if I was, like, looking at their individual chart.
Oh, interesting.
Um, but I personally don't go past 8 degrees for an orb,
Hmm.
so that's usually the widest that I'll go. And it's worth noting like the 12-degree orb for eclipses with the nodes, but that's a little bit different because that might just tell you that someone is born either between eclipses or very close to an eclipse. But 12 degrees in and of itself would be a pretty wide orb even for the moon.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, great to know. Are we assuming a particular house system when we're talking about the nodes in the houses? What house system do you use, or does it not really matter?
Yeah, I mean, generally, I'll use whole sign. I was kind of like raised with Placidus, if you
Hmm.
will. And generally, I'll use whole sign, but sometimes I'll use Placidus for certain things. And I don't think it matters because ideally, this is obviously like a larger conversation
Yeah,
about house
absolutely.
systems that I'm perhaps a little bit more uh like Aquarian about, or sort of like big picture about, than some other people.
Uh-huh.
And for me, I'm not hard fixed on a right or wrong way. I'm just using what I see to work.
Hmm.
And so a lot of my house system transition had to do with seeing something working and functioning in a particular way, but I don't discredit quadrant houses or using Placidus in any way at all. And I'll often use them for certain things that I'm doing. So I don't think it has a bearing in that way. I think it's more important to be consistent with whatever
Mm,
you're doing,
yeah.
unless you're invested on transitioning into a different framework astrologically. So if you're a person who uses whole sign houses, then absolutely look at your nodes through a whole sign perspective and vice versa for a quadrant system and all that.
Mm, okay, cool. Yeah, I just wanted to make that clear for listeners.
Mhm.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about the nodes in different signs and different houses. And so I was wondering if you could give a brief description of the nodes in each of the houses and how they can play into natal astrology.
Yeah, we can do this as like a fun little mini cookbook. And yeah, feel free to like chime in with your wonderful thoughts on this as well. I know you've been thinking a lot about the nodes.
Hmm.
Um, I'll kind of do them mixed together because to have, say, the South Node in the first and the North Node in the seventh is thematically different from having them opposite, like South
Yeah,
Node in the seventh, North Node in the first.
absolutely.
But that can change depending on, the sign and planetary aspects and stuff. So I'll just kind of give the general themes. But so if you have the nodes on a first seventh axis, um, in a very simplistic level, this has a lot to do with self and other.
Hmm.
So there may be themes in the person's life where they're either like more comfortable in a kind of like lone wolf expression and have to grow into a state of trust with people,
Hmm.
or vice versa, where there's maybe like an inherent kind of enmeshment that the person leans towards with other people, and it's hard for them to grow into themselves, or it takes longer in their life for them to kind of grow into themselves a little bit. With the second and the eighth house, I would say in an interesting way, this has to do with like experience of body in the world and then experience of proximity to other bodies or other people.
Mm,
Um, and depending on which way the nodes are or where they're flipped, like sometimes this axis can lend itself to a little bit of intensity, but also meaning a person who's interested in kind of like looking under the hood of the car, if you will.
yeah.
And depending on where the nodes are on that axis or how they're flipped, like a lot of the person's life may have to do with generating just a very simple state of peace for them to feel okay and at home in their body.
Mm,
um, or it may be about allowing themselves to explore complexity and not fearing the stuff that is part of our reality, but not always looked at directly.
hmm.
It could also, be someone who's like a really amazing, like finance banker or something like that. There's
Hmm.
there's that kind of like tangible, practical aspect to the second and the eighth as well. That
Yeah.
might be someone. I'm thinking of one of my clients who has South Node in the eighth, North Node in the second, and is a really amazing. I'm forgetting the word. Investment banker. He's
Okay.
like a really, really gifted investment banker.
Hmm. So yeah, like his career, at least in this time, kind of surrounds his resources as well as other people's resources. Investments are usually taking other people's money
Mhm.
and making money out of them.
Exactly. And yeah, the reason why I don't like to think of the nodes in such a binary way as like
Hmm.
the south node is your bad thing that you're doing and the north node is your good thing that you should do more of,
Yeah.
is because I don't think that they function like that. Like if you
Hmm.
think of that example, there's someone who is working really closely and intimately with other people's money, and therefore building a really sturdy second house for himself with,
Right.
strong foundation, and that supports his family, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think an interesting image that I have of the nodes that came to mind earlier was like, or a kind of term is like the nodes are a fulcrum.
Mm.
And so if you think of like a seesaw, one
Mm.
side is up and the other side is down, and you could perhaps like one side has an energy, like a stored kinetic energy that can move, and the other side is like waiting to come back down. It has less, I don't know, it's like its energy's been released in some sense. I feel like there's like something about that image that feels right, and I think it brings to mind what I've heard about the nodes in terms of like, yeah, you're not necessarily supposed to quote unquote, you're not supposed to do anything, but you're not supposed to like choose the north node and
Mm.
shun the south node. It's kind of about a balance. And I feel like, I don't know, my life feels like a great example of the third nine, south node, north node dynamic. If we can kind of move on to that,
Mhm.
I have my south node in the ninth house and I have my north node in the third house. The ninth house is Leo and the third house is Aquarius. And ninth house topics are something that have always come very naturally to me. I
Mhm.
studied philosophy in college. I think a lot about big ideas. I like travel, like spirituality and religiosity, even to a sense, have often been very important topics in my life.
Mm.
It's something that kind of just like feels like it fits like a glove. Like it feels like a natural thing that's very easy for me to fall back on. Feels like a loaded word in this context,
Mm.
but fall back on in a sense. It doesn't feel like a bad thing. It just feels like a very natural thing. And I think with the North Node in the third house, co-present Venus is quite far away, and co-present Vesta as well. So there's like another kind of like ritual element with
Mm.
like the spiritual nature, I think, of the third house. Ritual is something that I very much hunger for, and something that I very much like do think I get a lot out of. So much so that like when I was in college, I was very religious, and um, I went to church every day. There was a time when I went to mass like on a daily basis. And I did that because it felt very comforting to experience every single day for 45 minutes to an hour, a ritual that had existed for thousands of years and that was the same basically every time. The kind of fixity of Aquarius and on that third sign, the kind of oldness of that Saturnian sign, and the sameness with the fixity, and it just felt incredibly comforting and moving, and it felt like there was a lot of growth for me within that place. So the North Node, it feels like that's something I kind of hunger for. And maybe I have to move a little bit further away from the ninth house stuff and move more towards the embodiment of and the practice of spirituality, rather than the kind of big ideas about it. Maybe that's kind of part of my story.
Mm.
Do you have any thoughts on the third ninth axis?
So many. Yeah. And so many thoughts on what you were saying. That's such a beautiful description of this notion of a fulcrum, or like the image that you gave of like a seesaw tipping and kind of like pouring something into the lower vessel.
Mm,
Because I hear that in your third ninth axis as well, that um, the third house type ritual that you're leaning into is of a ninth house nature.
right.
You immediately defaulted to spiritual ritual or philosophical or astrological ritual, and
Hmm.
tracking the cycles of the planets is a very third, ninth kind of axis to me. So
Yeah.
I think that's really beautiful because it shows that you can't separate them.
Hmm.
And I do think there are time periods where maybe like our north node is more activated than our south node, depending on, what perfection year you're in, or like what ZR level you're in, or the transits or something like that. But um they're always in opposition. So if
Hmm.
one node is activated, the other one is activated. It just might be like a different aspect.
Yeah.
So that's a really beautiful, like very visceral way to describe that third, ninth axis, I think.
Hmm.
And yeah, there is something about like a sacred and secular axis that exists between the third and ninth. So there's always going to be some conversation there between the mundane whittling away the hours experience of the third house, and then the vast grand perspective of the ninth,
Mm-hmm.
and how we do or don't find ways to like pull that vastness into our day-to-day mundane routines,
Mm-hmm.
or vice versa, to bring the secular into the divine,
Yes.
and see them as related in that way.
Yeah, a few other things that kind of come to mind with me for this access is one, it's a lot easier for me to like read an astrological text than to do an astrological ritual, for example. And I feel like
Mm,
that speaks to
mm,
kind of, it feels more natural to just kind of engage with the written word, the knowledge, the kind of like the logos of the ninth house, rather than okay, taking the action to kind of conduct the ritual in the third house. And it's like I'm mindful of the fact that I need to be taking that action more and embodying that kind of north node a little bit more. It feels like that's a place that I want to move, but there is a little resistance there for one. It feels a little bit harder. There's some friction.
mhm,
And the other thing I think that comes to mind is like in my early 20s, especially, I traveled a lot. I was living in Europe and I traveled to many countries in Europe and North Africa. And there's a lot of tropes about travel and how travel can be transformative. And I often think, um, having traveled a lot, I'm like a little bit more critical of that
mhm,
now that I've like, done a ton of it. And there's something about like the beauty or kind of like seeing this kind of idea of seeing the world with fresh eyes, but when you're able to leave home and travel, and this kind of idea of the third house with the local environment of like, why can't you see, um getting emotional just talking about it, but like, why
mm.
can't you see, and I'm like in my hometown too, so I think that's probably why.
Yeah.
um why can't you see your hometown with those eyes? Why can't you see
Mm.
the things that you see every day as if they're new? And I think that that's kind of speaks to that kind of third house north node as well in some ways.
Mm.
So yeah, those are additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think about the very profound spiritual practice of seeing God or seeing love in everything.
Yeah.
And how, in many ways, that's the hardest thing to do, because that experience of travel, bringing something that you can't have at home, feeds into a notion that something good is out there rather
Mm,
than right here in front of us, or that
right.
we have to leave to, it's very like hero's journey. We have to leave to find the thing of meaning
Hmm.
rather than it being right in front of our noses, or like it is our noses, like
Hmm.
it's part of the stuff of life, and being able to see love and God in the very thing that's right in front, in our neighborhood, in our third house.
Yeah, and I think with the hero's journey and the third ninth axis in particular, it's like going on a scavenger hunt or going on a treasure hunt, like finding like all these clues and then realizing that like at the end the treasure was like buried next door to your house. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Uh
Yeah.
so it's like having to go out to come back and find the thing that you're looking for feels apt.
Yes, or yeah, when the ninth house hero goes off to like find the treasure out in the world, someone is back in the third house, like taking care of the kids in the community,
Hmm.
like that they function together
Right.
in that way. Someone has to be there caring for the connections in the community in order for the hero to go off and individuate and
Right.
find
Yeah.
some deeper treasure.
Yeah, and I do feel like that speaks to the third house as like the local church, and the ninth house is
Mhm.
like the ninth house I think is associated with long distance travel because it's associated with the pilgrimage, the thing that you
Mhm.
do like once in your lifetime. And to
Yeah.
do that takes a lot of resources, which is kind of
Yes.
funded on the local level, and it's made possible by your neighbors and things like that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, shall we move on to the fourth and the 10th?
Yeah, this is a third house podcast now.
It's always been a third house podcast, let's be
Yeah,
real.
well, I mean, that's what a podcast is. So,
Yeah.
yeah, just a funny detail that you're podcasting now with your North Node in Aquarius in the third.
Hmm.
Yeah, so 4th and 10th on a very simplistic level, I think about as privacy and visibility.
Mm,
So, depending on where the nodes are, I think when there's overemphasis on the 10th house, people, in addition to sometimes being very ambitious or, having a great sense of purpose, can also have a feeling of like overexposure, or as if like their backs are pinned to a wall
mm,
and there's nowhere for them to turn to have inner space or private space. And conversely, like overemphasis on the 4th house can lead to people feeling quite invisible,
mm,
and not able to find comfort in places of greater visibility. So there's that aspect to it. And there's also kind of an inherent theme of the stuff that we're given through our family, and
mhm,
the epigenetics of the 4th house, if you
mhm,
will, or the intergenerational themes that are there, and then what we go out and do with that, and the way that we are always informed by our roots, but sometimes the response is in reaction to it or in opposition to it. And so our
right.
10th house is sometimes like the thing that we want to do in the world that undoes our roots or undoes the fate and circumstance of our 4th house.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes between of the tension between, like, home and family and, like, praxis, if we can think about the
Mhm.
10th house as, like, how you embody your worldview, and
Mhm.
sometimes there's a tension between the individual and their beliefs and how that's embodied with, like, what the family would prefer. And I feel like that can kind
Mhm.
of speak to that 4th house, 10th house axis as well, particularly, I think, if the nodes are there.
Oh, absolutely. And I think with the 4th and 10th, it's helpful to think about how things might have been before the way they are now in like a
Mm,
very modern world where perhaps for some people in some circumstances, there's a lot more choice than there may have been in
mhm,
previous generations, where the career or the kind of life purpose that you have is governed by the family that you're born into and
mm,
like their place in the community and the skills that that family inherently has. And so there's this kind of given um slide. It's like a water slide from the 4th into the 10th that
mm,
probably has changed quite a bit over time, especially depending on where you live in the world and what the kind of socioeconomic opportunities are that come out of your circumstance. There might be a lot more choice than what we had before.
mm. Yeah, that's super, super interesting, and it makes me think about, just kind of thinking about the 4th in relationship to the 8th and how that plays into the 8th and the 10th, and I tend to think about the 4th as, like, the actual ancestors, like, the actual
Mm,
people, and the 8th as, like, the material things that you inherit. I'm reminded of, Mashallah, like, one of Ben Dykes' translations from the Latin of, like, the ruler of the 4th, or the ruler of the ascendant in the 4th and the 8th has the same, translation as, like, gifts from
mhm,
old things or inheritance, and it's interesting to think about the opposition between the 4th and the 10th, but the sextile between the 8th and the 10th, and the trine between the
mhm.
4th and the 8th, because I do feel like it's, like, a lot of people, we spoke about before, John Rawls' theory of justice, and it's like, we don't live in a world where opportunities are equal.
Yeah.
Many people get ahead because of the resources that their family has. And I do think that that's kind of represented in a way by the money that you get in the 8th, or the resources you get in the 8th, kind of in sextile with the 10th and support.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. There's like the natural support of the trine from the 4th house that can lead to inheritance, and then the sextile or the ease that that creates in the 10th house with
Mm-hmm.
what someone wants to do. And conversely, if there are challenges in any of those houses, it's going to translate to all of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you have like a really tough malefic in one of those houses, that's going to create a trine to your 4th and a sextile to your 10th or something like that. It's
Mm-hmm.
going to have the same kind of translation there, and that does work on a very practical level in people's lives. But that's an interesting way to think about it, because I also think about the 4th, 8th, and 12th as our right brain houses,
Mm, interesting.
and the 4th as a kind of like personal, subjective, or subconscious experience, and then the 8th
Mm,
as a kind of relational, subjective experience, and then the 12th as a more collective or group oriented subjective experience.
mm,
And the way that those sort of feed into one another, and then kind of couch the 10th house in like a kite aspect within that, and
mm-hmm.
what comes out of our subjectivity, or what comes out of our intuitive right brain spaces, is what gets expressed in the world.
Mm. Man, that's fascinating to think about. Yeah, it's super interesting. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Hmm.
Cool.
Hmm. Yeah. um yeah, 5th and 11th, which are the hardest to say out loud. So I know that the 5th has a lot of associations with creativity and children, and those are the kind of entry level associations with it. But I also think about it as creativity, like in the raw, true sense, which is not just making a painting or making a song, but actual creation, like to make something into existence that wasn't in existence before.
Mm,
And all of us have some version of that. We all have a 5th house. And so there's creation or generation of joy and pleasure that happens, that is always in relationship to our community and the place where we belong. And so there's this natural relationship there with when the nodes are in those houses, where the more we experience belonging, the more generative we can be in our lives,
mm,
and the more joy we experience as we have connection.
mhm.
And conversely, when there's challenges there, like feeling alienated, or sometimes tough things in the 11th can represent like a feeling of being exiled from the community, or
Right.
exiled from a sense of belonging. And life becomes very dry, and like we lose our pleasure receptors, or we lose our capacity for creation.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the fifth as just like the place that we find joy, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, and its opposition to this place of community. It's interesting that they call the fifth house the house of good fortune,
Mhm.
and they call the 11th the house of good spirit. And so it's interesting that these things are opposed, but they're both positive houses because of their relationship to the ascendant with the trine with the fifth and the sextile with the 11th. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, that's interesting, very interesting thought.
Yeah. Yeah, and it says something about the difference in goodness for the benefics, like
Hmm.
that Venus finds its joy in the 5th and is opposite the joy of Jupiter in
Hmm.
the 11th, and that they have very different priorities, because the
Mm.
5th house is much more individual than the
Yeah.
11th house is. And so that speaks to, what goodness and joy and pleasure are for Venus, which is often something that can be very personal or one
Hmm.
to one relational in that way.
Right.
And then for Jupiter, which is like, this is for the good of all, or, for the community or for the group itself.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, a little less positive, the 6th and the 12th.
Yeah.
The house of bad spirit and the house of bad fortune.
Yeah, and in this way, we could say, like, Mars has different priorities for chaos than Saturn does, like, they
Mhm.
also have their own oppositional preferences for,
Yeah.
um, chaos.
Mhm, mhm.
Uh, well, 6th and 12th, I think of as a almost like the 12th has such a threshold of incarnation feeling to it. And as we know, anything that's in the 12th was rising during someone's birth experience.
Mhm,
And so there is a bit of like a liminal or threshold state to nodes that are in the 6th and 12th. But I think for a person who has this nodal axis, it can create a lot of uh, interesting challenge and interplay between um, what is done in the world in service and then what is needed for the individual for their own like sense of well-being.
mhm,
So sometimes this axis can have a burning the candle at both ends kind of feeling to it
mhm,
because there's an emphasis on overdoing or over service or over giving with the sixth house, and then a need for retreat and space and solitude with the 12th. And sometimes it works the other way around where the person prefers an ascetic life that is remote from doing
mhm,
in the
mhm,
world, or we're thinking about patterning or ways of being comfortable with the nodes, and it's like the comfortable state is to be remote, and
mm,
to actually like enter into the world and do can be a very disruptive, terrifying thing. And there's sometimes like a kind of invisibility to this nodal axis as well, that what the person does is not really seen or acknowledged a lot of the time.
yeah. I think the 6th house, it absolutely reminds me of the work that perhaps like a house cleaner would do,
Mm.
or like traditional, comments about a mother's labor, for example, isn't really
Mm.
acknowledged. Like
Yeah.
there's so much, or thinking about how, parenthood or motherhood is like work, being a homemaker is work. And these kinds of commentaries, I think more recently that I've heard of, like, we should pay people for being a parent. We should pay
Mm.
people for the work that they do to maintain their household, because these things are labor, like real labor. But often, even in relationships where, talk about like a heteronormative relationship with a man and a woman and their child, the woman is expected to work and then also expected to come home and do more housework, or it's kind of, there are studies that show that that's kind of what happens, and oftentimes that is just not acknowledged. And I think that that kind of speaks to the 6th house for me, and the kind of aversion between the 6th house and the ascendant, this element of like not being seen. And then, yeah, I think with the 12th, like the 12th is associated with isolation. And you kind of speak to that with the joy of Saturn being there. Saturn is the furthest away.
Mhm.
Saturn is kind of isolated. But it's very interesting, yeah, to think about, yeah, so to think about that and the tension between what is the sustaining labor that's done in the 6th, and what are the ways, yeah, that someone needs to kind of get away to re-find themselves or maintain their identity, what have you.
Mm. Yes. Yeah, I think your description of it as a place of invisible labor makes a lot of sense. And yeah, there's that kind of heteronormative invisible labor that can often happen. And then there's the invisible labor of activism as well, which is
Mhm.
like a 6/12th axis thing to me, where the activism that we're called to in the sixth is often because of the way that we feel in unbearable suffering in the 12th.
Yeah.
and it drives us to some kind of action or doing in the world because we feel something that exists in human experience that is deeply painful and needs to
Mm-hmm.
be remedied.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that part of it too. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about one of my beautiful teachers and mentors in LA. His name's Orland Bishop, and he has a lot of really profound teachings on initiation.
Mm-hmm.
And he speaks about physical illness as a necessary threshold of any spiritual initiate, and that he considers all spiritual initiates to require some kind of physical challenge at some point in their life that they need to contend with because it's a doorway of initiation or something that creates an opening into a deeper, more awake way of living in the world that necessarily has to happen through the physical body.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that really speaks to that axis as well, is that there may be something that comes through the body or like the experience of health in the sixth that gives way to like a deeper, more initiatory experience in the 12th.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience of that. And like, yeah, like I got sober when I was 18, and so I kind of like have a history of addiction, especially in my teens, but that's just something I kind of identify with. And that experience of kind of coming to this physical crisis with addiction is
Hmm.
something that has absolutely transformed my life in reference to my spiritual life. And yeah, I don't think I would have had that without that experience. And I think that the reality of like that physical reality is something that continues to propel me to nourish my spiritual life, because nourishing my spiritual life kind of can keep that physical reality in check. So yeah, I don't know if that's, it's like it's interesting to think about physical crisis in different ways. It's like stress can be its own kind of physical crisis. It doesn't necessarily have to be like an illness or something like that. But yeah, most people, I think, they hit they hit a bottom, or they hit a brick wall because of some kind of exhaustion or stress, or kind of that kind of situation where it's like, I can't live this way anymore. I have to make some kind of change.
Mm. Yeah, that's so interesting. It's like a critical mass that
Hmm.
happens. And it is generally like that with crisis or experiences of unwellness that kind of bring us to these states of critical mass. And in a way, like the 12th house is a critical mass because it's like the point before incarnation or before birth.
Hmm.
And if you think about what's happening right before a birth, it's like this,
Labor.
yeah, it's labor,
Yeah.
exactly. And there's this critical mass of, okay, the state that things have been in must change dramatically
Hmm.
now. Like the incarnation has to happen.
Right.
So it does have that feeling of imperative to it as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm. Yeah, and to be a little bit more nuanced about this idea, because I do think it's important astrologically, because we're looking at the moment of birth for a natal chart. And so yeah, the 12th house does tell us about the experience of the birth for the mother or for the gestating parent. And historically, maternal fatalities have been relatively high. Like I don't
Mm.
have a good knowledge of how this has gone throughout history, but uh, I think it's not a stretch to say that death during childbirth for the gestating parent has been like a major kind of danger. And so I think that kind of speaks to the 12th house being perhaps the worst house, because that's the part that's rising, right before the birth, where the mother's or the gestating parent is like at their most vulnerable, kind of dangerous moment.
Absolutely. Yeah. And coming back to this idea of the nodes as being a kind of circumstance that occurs to us, if you
Hmm.
have a node in the 12th house, that may represent some kind of circumstance beyond the gestating parent's control that happened in the birthing process or as the birth was occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like I feel like I had like a little aha moment around that because sunrise is like my favorite time of day. And so, when I think about, since I've been a student of astrology, like the sun in the 12th house, I'm like, this is actually quite a beautiful time. There is a liminality to it and does feel very uh it does have a very distinct feeling to it, but the feeling is not one of badness or that like the sun is in a maltreated place. But to think about it in terms of the actual reality of the birth, I feel like it makes a lot more sense.
Mhm. Yes, yeah, because a sunrise might be a lot more peaceful than most of our birth experiences.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, it is an interesting, even just the contrast between like diurnal motion and zodiacal motion
Hmm.
gives the 12th house a very different feeling.
Hmm.
Um, whether we're crossing into the underworld or coming out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we've talked about the houses. How do you see nodal returns and reversals and just transits of the nodes to the natal chart show up for clients?
Very strongly.
Mm,
um, because the nodes are not planets, they function a little bit differently. But we were talking about them as this sort of intersection of self and circumstance, or this like meeting of our personal will with fate or with the rest of the world. So, a lot of the time when there are transits to the nodes, or there's a nodal return or a reversal or something like that, or the node is activated through one of the timing techniques, there are often like circumstances beyond someone's control that come into their life
mm,
that tend to have a sometimes disruptive or shifting or changing interpretation to them. So, depending on where the nodes are, what's being activated, the person might leave like a 20-year career, or, end an extremely long relationship, or, something happens in their family and they have to move across the world. Like there tend to be really big fatalistic things that we didn't choose, but we now have to respond to,
hmm.
and we have to kind of integrate into our experience. So I find this to be different from the way planetary returns and aspects work,
Hmm.
because there's less of like this individual action taking place, and more like a point of intersection or something that we're responding to. But certainly just looking at a nodal return or a nodal reversal is something that can be quite powerful, I think, and even just starting to understand the nature of the nodal cycle that happens as its own cycle in our lives.
Mm, yeah. And how about when transiting planets are kind of aspecting or in conjunction with the natal nodes? What effect do you see having with that?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting thing because it takes something that is a day-to-day repetitive pattern for us
Hmm.
and brings it to the foreground or puts it in question in a new way. And I often see a lot of really helpful disruption to people's familiar ways of going
Hmm.
about life that might feel, sometimes challenging at the time. But it's like, oh, that thing that I've been doing my whole life isn't working for me anymore. Suddenly I have to find a different way of doing this. And whatever that different way is usually informed by the planet that's part of the transit. Like it's lending some of its personal expression or personal power to this shift in the pattern that is familiar for the person.
Hmm.
And I think earlier when we were talking about like the symbolism of the nodes and how they might function, I forgot to mention that I also think about them as these kind of neural pathways.
Mm,
And much in the same way that our neural pathways are often like an intersection of the right brain and the left brain, the nodes are kind of like a right brain, left brain intersection too, because they're taking the path of the sun and the path of the moon and creating an intersection or a pathway between them.
Mm,
And so when we have planets transiting the nodes, there might be some kind of shift or change in our familiar patterning or our neural pathways that we tend to default to, and we have to construct or reach for something different.
mm. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, to go back to our first part of this conversation, I talked about Venus retrograde and how it affects my life in significant ways every time it's in Leo. And I think part of it probably has to do with the fact that I have natal Venus in Aquarius. And so there's an opposition, but perhaps more so um, the last two, maybe three Venus retrogrades in Leo, Venus transits over my natal south node and opposes my natal north node. And so there's definitely, it definitely makes sense that these are important transits every 8 years for me.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, you were talking earlier about that quest for love outside the home or outside your kind of like origin community. And that's so Venus on your south node, like the
Hmm.
question of like, why does it feel easier to find love elsewhere
Mm,
or experience this kind of love or connection elsewhere than it does to have that at home?
yeah. Yeah. And I think perhaps, like, as I was talking about planets going retrograde in my ninth, especially, I kind of spoke to Jupiter and Venus. My fourth house is Pisces. And so both planets are kind of associated with Pisces. Jupiter rules it by domicile, and Venus is the exaltation lord. So perhaps it speaks to, especially when it's transiting the ninth, finding a new home in a different place that's kind of far away.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's an interesting addendum to our conversation about planets transiting the nodes is what is happening is going to be informed by the houses that they rule
Hmm.
or where that planet is natally in the chart, like it's going to bring some of that influence in to how it's affecting our reshaping of patterning and our reorientation to the themes in our life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, everything needs to be kind of contextualized with the natal chart more
Hmm.
broadly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so let's talk about eclipses. What are eclipses and what impacts can they have on both like the world astrology, as well as on natal astrology?
So eclipses, from our perspective, are when the well, a solar eclipse would be when the moon appears to cross in front of the sun, and a lunar eclipse would be on a full-ish moon when the sun appears to cross in front of the moon.
Hmm.
So that's what we're seeing in the sky. And then when we think about, and there's partial and total eclipses because they might not be in the exact same declination at that time.
Hmm.
But when we think about the definition of the nodes, which are these points of intersection between the sun's ecliptic and the moon's path, we can understand that when there's an eclipse happening, the nodes must be involved
Hmm.
because we know that the sun and the moon are lining up in some kind of way when there's an eclipse. So we know that they must be near those like 2 points of connection between their paths in the sky that are represented by the nodes.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the big picture of it. But if we're looking at a chart, you can tell when an eclipse is happening when the sun and the moon are somewhere within 12 degrees from a node during a lunation.
Hmm.
But say, for instance, someone is born with like the sun 6 degrees from the north node, and then the moon is at the south bending.
Hmm.
That person is not born during an eclipse, but you can see that they're born during an eclipse season
Right.
because the sun is close to the node. And so an eclipse would have happened just before or after their birth.
Right. Their prenatal lunation would have been an eclipse, and that can be significant for their life.
Hmm.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. How did people think about eclipses historically, and what do they kind of mean astrologically?
Well, I think people probably thought the world was ending. Like,
Yeah, they tend to be thought of as like not the best events.
yeah. Yeah. And again, I'm probably a little more middle ground about that than
Hmm.
some of my friends or colleagues, or more to one end than some friends and more to the other end than others. But
Yeah.
I think that the idea that eclipses are awful
Mm.
comes from like the very ancient early experience of looking up at the sky and something is covering the sun,
Right.
and suddenly it's dark in the middle of the day. Like,
Hmm.
it's a surreal experience if
Yeah.
you've ever seen a solar eclipse. And so perhaps, like, I wasn't there at that time to the best of my knowledge, but like perhaps it had this apocalyptic feeling to
Hmm.
it that was like some order of nature is being disrupted.
Yeah.
Something is out of whack here. Something is not functioning as it usually is.
Hmm.
And so all of that is true of eclipses. Something that we naturally experience is disrupted. There is something that is out of whack with our usual way of experiencing it,
Hmm.
but it's not necessarily apocalyptic. I mean, some tough things can happen during eclipse season for sure. I don't think that's in any way to be discredited, but I think about it in context of how I think about the nodes. And when we confront our habitual patterned way of doing things, it honestly feels like death a
Mm.
lot of the time. And it can feel like something is going to die or to end when we disrupt the consistent path of motion that we've been on.
Yeah.
And so again, that's not to discredit like the loss and the chaos and the difficulty that can happen during
Hmm.
eclipses, but it's also to say that disruption is part of life, and it's
Hmm.
part of the cycles that we are in. And so there's also something really intriguing about that to me.
Yeah.
And I've had incredible experiences during eclipse season as well. So I don't think it's really such a binary thing.
Yeah. I've had amazing things happen during eclipse seasons. I've had some more tough things happen during eclipse seasons.
Mhm.
To give a little bit, I think, of like a historical context, one of the stories that comes to mind, which I think I heard from Austin Coppock on the astrology podcast, is like if we think about the sun as the king again, and there's an occultation of that, there's a covering up of that. Historically, eclipses were thought of as a time where the sovereign was vulnerable. And so there's a kind of story about like taking like a fool, like this more perhaps like Saturnian figure of like a jester, and making them be a stand-in for the king during the eclipse to protect the king from death.
Mm.
And additionally, kind of astrologically, I'm a horary practitioner, and in basically every horary text, there's a list of harms that can befall the moon, because the condition of the moon is very important in horary. And one of them is if the moon is with the head or tail, is with one of the nodes. And so that's considered a negative point. It's
Mhm.
not a deal breaker necessarily, depending on what the question is and depending on other contexts that of the chart, the story that the chart is telling. But it's interesting to think about the nodes in or eclipses in those contexts. And then additionally, I think, yeah, it's really interesting. I know people that, Cameron Cassidy talked about like, yeah, I go and watch the eclipses. Like I love watching it. I know people who are like, yeah, I close the blinds. I don't go outside that whole day.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, the even the response from professional astrologers is like kind of runs the gamut, which is quite funny.
Totally. Yeah. And there's a few things in there that you mentioned that I think are really important. One of them is that considerations for a person are going to be really different from considerations with horary or electional astrology,
Hmm.
because I think we can be a little more binary about our delineation in a horary chart, or if
Yeah.
we're electing something. There are different signatures that will amount to more positive or negative results in that context.
Hmm.
But if we're talking about a person and their life, like nobody is binary really. Like
Right.
nobody is all good or all bad, and none of our experience is really completely one or the other. So I think that's a really great distinction of how you might look at it in a horary context, or if you're electing a chart. Depending on what you're doing, you probably don't want to elect a chart
Uh-huh.
during eclipse season. Like that's one thing that's safe to say, unless you're like doing chaos magic, and then
Hmm.
that's like a fantastic election to use.
Yeah.
But in the life of a person, obviously that's going to register very differently.
Hmm.
And it kind of connects to the other thing that I was thinking about while you were describing that sense of, the sun being the king, and the the foretold disruption of eclipse season, and to the king's order and rule. And for me, it's really important to integrate traditional technique through a critical lens of what we perhaps know now that we may not have known at that time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so when I think about dignity, I think about it as like, well, good for who and bad for who,
Right.
and good for doing what and bad for doing what,
Hmm.
because I really don't come from the perspective that like a ton of exaltation in a chart means the person is having a great time and the nicest life ever.
Hmm.
It may actually be the opposite experientially. So I think there's something of that with eclipses too, where it's like, yeah, a lot of the really intense association with it is because so much of traditional astrology is grounded in the monarchy,
Hmm.
and like in a very colonial framework of
Right.
it being used to support the person with the most power in the community.
Right. Yeah. It being a kind of propaganda, for lack of a better term, to add validity to the reigning authority.
Totally. And maybe the eclipse is like when people take to the streets to overthrow the king. And in that sense, I'm all for it.
Who's unjust. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and to just, kind of speak to what you said about exaltation, I'm really fascinated with exaltation because my ascendant ruler is exalted, and it's in the eighth house, so it's in like a quote unquote bad
Mm.
house. And it's like, yeah, you spoke to like a good time or a bad time, and it's like, I think how we've been talking about like a life is a long thing to live, and there's a lot of different ways that things can manifest, and it's like I absolutely experienced my Jupiter exalted in the eighth as both a bad time and a good time.
Exactly.
It's a combination of both. I think part of my again, Jupiter in the eighth ruling the fourth, addiction is a family
Hmm.
disease, and I think that kind of speaks to that. But it also, I got sober very young.
Mm.
Like I know many people that have gotten sober young as well, but it's not super common to get sober at 18 years old. And I found a ton of meaning through my experiences of both addiction and sobriety. And I think that also speaks to the possibility of that with the exalted planet, and also the reality of some of the challenges. So these things can manifest in simultaneously positive and negative ways,
Yeah,
um, which is fascinating.
absolutely. Yeah. And conversely, I have a chart that like, makes some astrologers cringe. They're like, "Oh no." Like
Mm,
there's a lot of like really quote unquote negative delineations in my chart, but here I am, a person living my life. I'm alive,
mm-hmm,
I have so much to be thankful for.
mm,
And there's lots that I can point to in my life that matches those delineations. But also when you're a living, breathing experience of something, we can't really be so polarized with this is good and this is bad. It might just mean like, okay, I have a chart with a lot of like really tough delineations. Therefore, I tend to work in the margins of life, or, I
mm-hmm,
ran a festival for underrepresented artists. Like there's so many ways that that can actually show up in a person's experience. And like you said, a lot of the time it can also show the perseverance of something or the overcoming or like a working through of something that's there.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate
Mhm.
it. I'm reminded of my conversation with Angeles Lopez, and we basically like kind of laughed about all the maltreatments in both of both of our charts from like a
Yeah.
Hellenistic perspective. And we're both just like, yeah, we're kicking it. We're finding joy and finding meaning in life. And
Yeah.
like it doesn't have to be, I mean, it was very kind of reading Dimitri's book and being like, damn it, like all this stuff in my chart, like, but it's like beyond the once that kind of challenge of like hearing it for the first time kind of wore off, it's like, okay, I kind of get it.
Mhm.
And there's also it's not the end. There's like a lot of opportunity to actually work with it. And yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for those of us astrologers who consult as well, I think those are really important considerations because unless your client is an astrologer, they don't know what detriment and exaltation are. So if
Mm-hmm.
they're coming to you to talk about their lives and we're like, oof, there's this like really bad thing in your chart that can be terrifying for someone. And
Yeah,
I'm really
absolutely.
not someone who likes to sugarcoat things. I think it's important to be direct and honest, but also
Mm-hmm.
to give someone the full spectrum of power that they're due in their own lives as well. So yeah, I think it's an important consideration. And I do get more and more clients who are just dabbling in astrology on their own because I think it's becoming a little more of a widespread interest certainly than it was like when I started practicing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I see showing up a lot lately is people who will hear or read something online that seems really concerning to them.
Right.
And there's a lot of fear about how that might apply to their lives. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think it's important for us to be honest about the whole spectrum
Right.
and to really help people understand what is possible for them within that.
Yeah. To quote or to paraphrase Richard Charnas, like these are archetypal significations. Like you spoke about in the intergenerational astrology episode with Chris, like there's not something that you can look at and be like, oh, this is the way that it manifests. Like everything
Mhm.
is discovered kind of in conversation and in dialogue with the client about how that manifests in their life. Because there's a multitude of ways that any particular thing can manifest.
Exactly. Like to our earlier point about tough things in our chart, there was one astrologer that I went to see when I was like 23 or something, like I was very young.
Mm-hmm.
And she said something to me along the lines of like, I've never seen someone with this configuration in their chart have a happy relationship,
Ooh,
period. And at the time, that was such a devastating thing for me to
yeah.
hear. And, I've gone on to prove that wrong over the course of
Mm-hmm.
my life. So I'm like, oh, phew,
Yeah.
but there can be real harm done in saying something like that to a
Mm-hmm.
person who doesn't themselves know astrology, where I later learned more myself as an astrologer and was like, oh, that's not how I would interpret that
Mm-hmm.
aspect. And I don't think there's anything in a chart that could really say that about someone.
Yeah, I think to speak again to like my earlier comment about sometimes we can't do things if we don't think they're possible. I think conversely, it's like if someone tells you you're never going to be able to do this, and I suppose we're all adults and we're all responsible for what the realities that we hold and stuff like that. But yeah, doing astrology, it's a very vulnerable thing in a way. And
Mhm.
I do think astrologers, consulting astrologers have a responsibility to communicate in ways that, again, like you spoke about in that episode, the Hippocratic Oath of do no harm, first do no harm. And so, yeah, in what ways is it? I suppose maybe it could be helpful if you were clinging to wanting a relationship, and maybe you are not meant for a traditional marriage and that kind of thing. I don't know. It's like maybe you can let go of that, but yeah, I think the question comes to mind of in what ways is it helpful to tell someone, oh, I've never seen anybody have a healthy, successful relationship with this kind of configuration.
Exactly. Yeah. Maybe if you're a far, far, far more proficient astrologer than I, there are things that you could definitively say about someone's chart. I mean, my personal perspective is that there's nothing that we can say with that kind of certainty about a
Hmm.
chart. We might be able to like make much more succinct prediction about a transit
Yeah.
or a ZR level or something like that. But yeah, also then what's the use? Does this actually, and that's the question I always come back to, does this help this person?
Hmm.
Is saying this to them going to support their life in some very real, clear way that I can see? Or is it going to cause unnecessary distress? And I think that there's helpful distress that astrologers can cause, where,
Hmm.
I like to be honest with my clients if they have a Pluto transit coming or something like
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
So not to leave things out, but yeah, to really think in earnest about what is in that person's highest good or
Hmm.
how we can support them to the best of our abilities.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Let's talk briefly about the recent shift of the nodes, the South Node into Libra and the North Node into Aries. What do you think this can mean for us collectively, or individually? If you have thoughts on that,
Yeah, I had made a note here in our episode notes after listening to the Desiderare conversation that Sasha Ravich hosted,
amazing.
because
Such a good conversation.
12 out of 10 recommend to anyone who hasn't heard it. And
Absolutely.
oh God, so beautiful. All of the astrologers who were part of that conversation have it for sale on their websites
Hmm.
now, I believe. So completely worth going and listening to if you haven't already. But J.M. Hamadi had said something in that conversation that I thought was really funny. So I wrote it down at the time and said that the shift in the nodes from Taurus and Scorpio into Aries and Libra was like lovers switching position in bed
Ooh.
because of the shift in rulership from Venus and Mars. So we have had Mars ruling the South Node and Venus ruling the North Node for the last 18 months. And now that we've got the nodes in Aries and Libra, we have Mars ruling the North Node and Venus ruling the South Node.
Hmm.
So it's a really fun little non-binary switch, like sexy position kind of thing. But on a more tangible level, I think there's some kind of polarity that exists here between what we need for ourselves and what we need for the group.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, especially when Jupiter was in Aries, I was thinking a lot about the removal of rights that was happening,
Mm.
particularly in North America. And that was when Roe versus Wade was overturned, and, the beginning of rights being revoked for trans individuals in a lot of the states and things like that. And so there's this inherent opposition between the law that exists with the South Node in Libra and someone having said, these are the rules that we're all going to adhere to. And then the North Node in Aries saying, but what about people's right to individual existence?
Hmm.
Aries is such a existential sign, right? Like people with strong Aries placements or stelliums there often have this feeling of like waking up in the morning and just kind of like wondering how they're going to exist that day.
Mm.
And so there's this kind of loaded feeling of it with the nodes now of like what it's going to be like for us to continue to ideally push for like greater safety of expression and right to existence for all individuals, and then the strength of the law against that, or the rules that we have to adhere to in order to have some kind of belonging in our world.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting too. I think the shift happening with, especially the South Node into Libra, kind of coinciding with Venus's retrograde,
Mm.
and the kind of descent of Venus under the beams into the underworld, which is like a particularly kind of like the story of Anana is kind of particularly violent, I think,
Mhm.
compared to kind of the descent of Mercury, and Mercury is the psychopomp, like, delivering the news to Hades in the underworld. Um, and so it's just interesting to think about her rulership now of the South Node, from that position. And yeah, it's interesting. I'm wondering if there will be more of a kind of turn towards individuality, and less of a turn and less kind of focus on the collective, or less kind of concern with social graces
Mm.
in a way. Like the thing that came to mind when you were saying like this is what the North Node in Aries is saying in relation to Jupiter and Aries and all these kinds of changes in law is like, the law is saying like this is how it's going to be, and I think the North Node in Aries is basically like, no the fuck it isn't, this is not how it's going to be. You know what I mean? Like there does feel like a kind of real righteous anger with the North Node in Aries. So I'm curious if any of that kind of like resonates with you at all.
Absolutely. It's like rebellion against proprietary order in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think about um, the nodes in a mundane sense, like as they're transiting collectively, and then this idea of like habits or patterning or things that are passed down intergenerationally, then the South Node in Libra is this notion of it's this way because I said it's this way, and this is how we've always done it,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore you need to suppress your own expression or your own needs
Mm-hmm.
to do it the right way. I think Libra is often concerned with the right way of doing
Right.
things. And so the North Node is a rebellion against that.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's the chaos of saying there is no right way to do it. And mythologically, like Mars will often go to war and create chaos just to see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Just for fun.
Exactly. The ultimate like fuck around and find out mentality is Mars because he just wants to see what it's like to create chaos and see if he can win. So some of it is coming back to this notion of justice that we were talking about. The Aries Libra axis has a particular relationship to justice, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
but some of it is also just disrupting order for the sake of disrupting order,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just part of how the world works and part of how humans are.
Yeah, I think about subjectivity in general, and just how incomprehensible that can sometimes be, like
Mhm,
another person's reality being different than your own.
mhm,
And the North Node in Aries does kind of feel like I'm doing this because this is what is right for me. I don't care what is right for you or the collective. Like, this is what I need. So, this is what I'm doing. And I think about Venus as also a goddess of war,
mhm,
especially like thinking about like, you know, I'm trying to come up with a different kind of connection, but I think about Morning Star Venus and the associations of like the morning star with Lucifer, and this kind of like declaration, like kind of divine war kind of thing. And there does feel, not that I'm like a Satanist or anything, whatever, that's just what comes to mind. But I think about where Mars is like the fucking fuck around and find out, like I'm doing it just because I fucking feel like it. Who cares? It just seemed like a good thing to do at the time, which feels very kind of like Aries cardinal fire kind of thing. Like the cardinal air, it does feel like very purposeful.
mhm.
And it reminds me of this von Clausewitz quote, who's like a military theorist, which is that war is politics by other means, which feels very kind of Libran in a way, of it being another kind of tool towards a certain end.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Like there's how we were talking about it where like, Aries is the positive disruption of uh, Libra's adherence to a certain kind of order, but then, like you're saying, it's the other way around as well,
Hmm.
where there can be this inability to understand relationality,
Right.
or like an over prioritization of personal or individual expression just for the sake of it,
Hmm.
without understanding the beauty and connection that comes from relating to others or being part of something larger than ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Losing kind of sense of the broader glue that holds us all together,
Hmm.
or the why for doing things in relation to the collective.
Yeah, like it's makes me think, actually, because we're talking about how our entry into this involves the South Node's ruler in retrograde. And sorry, not in retrograde. I just used the worst astrological expression ever. Venus is retrograde.
Yeah.
And
It's pretty late at this
oh
point.
yeah,
We're
totally.
going
I'm in
on.
sleepy brain
Yeah.
now. But
Yeah, me too. We're gonna wrap it up
yeah,
soon.
totally. It's but there's, I mean, there's obviously a breakup season that's happening right now, and a lot of it is
Mhm,
happening very
mhm,
publicly. And it makes me think about in the 70s when Pluto was in Libra, or 70s or early 80s when Pluto was in Libra, if I'm getting those dates right.
mhm,
And it was like the first time that divorce became a kind of widely more culturally accepted thing.
mhm,
And so if we're, yeah, looking at Libran themes, it's either where we can, with Aries, like sometimes sacrifice the self in order to be in connection, but also that to some extent to relate to another means that our whole self is not always going to be seen and validated, and that's just the nature of human connection. Like
right.
that there's points of intersection that we have, but like you said, we are these completely unique subjective beings, and our whole self is not always going to be brought into that relational space.
Mhm, yeah. All right. Do you have any additional thoughts that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I don't think so. No, I feel like we've covered a lot of really fun ground here.
Yeah, I think we did it. Awesome. Erin, where can we find you, and is there anything that you're working on that you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, so I'm online at aerinfogel.com, or on Instagram, Queen of Swords Band, and then Twitter and Threads as Queen of Swords.
Mhm,
And uh, the main thing that I like to talk about is the family chart readings that I'm doing right now that I mentioned. I'm always doing consultations ongoing forever and ever.
mhm,
But yeah, I love doing family chart readings, and it's a pretty special way to be able to map out some of the intergenerational themes that are happening in a person's life, and how it's impacting them personally.
mhm,
And I do have some workshops that I'm working on, but I haven't announced them yet. So if you want to sign up for my mailing list, you'll be the first to hear about them. And like SP said earlier, I have a album that's been out for about 2 months now with my project Queen of Swords. So that's on the internet too, if you want to give it a listen.
awesome, wonderful. And just a note about the intergenerational, the family chart reading. People don't need birth times necessarily for their family members, correct? Or how do you kind of do that?
Yeah, for the person coming for the reading, definitely need a birth time.
Hmm.
But it's possible to do the readings without everyone having a birth time. And a lot of the time, most of the time, people don't have
Yeah.
a birth time for their grandparents, especially.
Hmm.
So that's fine. I mean, the more birth times, the better, but we're still going to get a lot of thematic content without looking at the houses and the
Hmm.
house placements and stuff like that.
Cool. Yeah, I just want to clarify that so people aren't like, oh, I can't do it because I don't know my
Mm.
mom's birth time or whatever, what have you.
Right. Yeah. No, bring me all the things.
Awesome. Yeah. All right, Erin, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a lovely conversation. Hope to talk to you soon. I hope you have a good one.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. and please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.